In my last video, I rebutted an argument made by Second Thought and the authors of the book, The People's Republic of Walmart. They argued that the successful planning and coordination of large businesses like Walmart prove that the problems of economic calculation in centrally planned economies have been solved. I argued that they were essentially making a category error. Walmart simply does not do the sort of planning that planned socialist economies like the Soviet Union attempted to do, and that while Walmart certainly is good at planning, existing in a market system is completely necessary to make what they do possible. Go ahead and watch that if you haven't, or watch it again if you feel like it, but it's by no means necessary for understanding this video. Today I'll be making a different critique of central planning, one that is not directly related to the knowledge problem or the problem of economic calculation. This video has to do with the incentives politicians face when tasked with economic planning, and why planning is inevitably going to produce bad results for the country as a whole. In a market economy, businesses and individuals are incentivized by profit. This is what the left hates about it. Of course, the profit motive isn't perfect. As its critics, left, right, and center will point out, there are externalities, there are collective action problems, and that which is profitable is not always the best for the most people. I think that these people greatly exaggerate the frequency and severity of these situations, but they do exist, and oftentimes the remedy or prevention of these situations does involve government action. The thing is, government action comes with its own set of liabilities. Given the frequency with which the online left calls for outright nationalization of industries.
But here's the problem. The solution to everything you just said is to nationalize it. So it's not less government control, it's going even further than Biden went.
Well, what do you
would
mean
you
by
support nationalizing it?
No,
But hey, look, it's the logical conclusion of the argument he just made. If we're only making tweaks around the edges and the problem is the system as such, great, I agree, nationalize it.
They seem to have no sense whatsoever of these potential liabilities. Of course, it's not just the online left and their nationalizations. Most people, most of the time, fail to consider any potential drawbacks when they talk about the government doing something it currently doesn't. I will see conservatives, who, in some of their moods, seem keenly aware of what government regulation entails, call for government regulation of social media companies, or protectionism for certain industries. In my experience, people tend to be realists when looking at government policies in practice, but they think things will work out exactly as they imagine when they talk about some new program or initiative. The fact is, government officials, whether you're talking about the politicians who pass the laws or the bureaucrats who enforce the laws, face their own set of incentives. And these incentives don't necessarily align with the so-called public interest. Leave aside for the moment that the public interest is oftentimes incredibly difficult to define. We'll come back to that later. For now, though, even if it wasn't, this wouldn't change the fact that government officials are not these Vulcans who will relentlessly pursue the public interest at the expense of everything else. No, much like the businessman pursuing profits, government officials are human beings pursuing their best interests. In other words, just because the market performs a certain function poorly does not mean that the government will perform that function well. Just because the profit motive may not always serve the public interest doesn't mean that government officials are necessarily incentivized to serve that interest either. Consider the recent example from the current negotiations over raising the debt ceiling. For those of you who don't know, the federal government of the United States has a self-imposed cap on the money it can borrow. The government actually hit the cap back in January, but they've been able to finance the government's expenses essentially through moving money around. However, the government's ability to do that may run out as early as June 1st, which means that if Congress fails to raise the debt ceiling before then, the US government could default. A government default would almost certainly put the economy in a recession, and it would likely put the dollar in further jeopardy. It would cause interest rates to rise, as the government would have to offer more generous terms on bonds after it inevitably does raise the debt ceiling, making everything for everyone more expensive, and making the interest on the debt an even larger portion of the federal budget than it already is. If ever there was something in the public interest, at least in the short term, it's raising the debt ceiling. So why haven't we raised it? Well, because it's so important, it makes for an excellent opportunity for politicians to extract concessions for various causes, including cutting various programs. This is precisely what the Republican Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, and much of the Republican caucus are trying to do. One of their primary targets has been cutting the expanded green energy tax credits passed in Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. Of course, Democrats are naturally not on board, but there are even some Republicans who aren't willing to go that far. According to Axios, a block of at least 8 Corn Belt Republicans are a hard no on the initial bill to raise the debt ceiling McCarthy proposed, unless it's revised to remove cuts to ethanol tax credits. 8 may not seem like a big number, but since Republicans only hold a 222 to 213 seat majority in the House, that's enough to sink a bill assuming party line vote. If ever there was something that was against the public interest, again assuming that such a thing actually exists in any meaningful sense, it's the ethanol program. And yet you have 8 representatives who are willing to hold up lifting the debt ceiling, which again, failure to do so would be catastrophic for the general public, so that they can keep their special program. As it happens, McCarthy ended up caving to these 8, and the House passed the bill. The bill will almost certainly not become law, so who knows if these representatives would actually vote no if their backs were truly up against the wall. But obviously McCarthy wasn't willing to risk that, so he gave them what they wanted. So why would these politicians jeopardize the public interest for the sake of a program that pretty much objectively does not serve the public interest? And what does any of this have to do with central planning? Well, the first part starts to make sense once you look at where these 8 representatives are from. 4 are from Iowa, 2 are from Minnesota, 1 is from Wisconsin, and another from Missouri, all corn-producing states. I doubt those 8 politicians want to default, but they're willing to put the country at greater risk for it, for the sake of the ethanol industry, because support from that industry is just that important to their careers. The fact is, they care more about preserving the benefits bestowed upon the ethanol industry than other politicians care about getting rid of those benefits, so they're much more likely to get their way. And while the ethanol program might not be in the best interest of the country as a whole, serving the ethanol producing community is in the best political interests of these politicians. If you put politicians in charge of the economy, whether they're micromanaging industry or they're trying to plan the whole thing, they're going to prioritize their political concerns over any economic ones, however broad those economic concerns may be. This all reminds me of a story former Republican Speaker of the House, John Boehner, who himself was involved in a debt ceiling fight back in 2011, told in his book On the House.
I was new to the Ohio State Legislature when I was approached about supporting a seemingly simple bill to get rid of the front license plates required on all cars in the state. At the time, many other states didn't require license plates to be on the front, just on the back. Some still don't. Why did Ohio have to have both? Like a small government conservative, I figured that cutting by half the number of license plates on cars would save the state money. We need to buy half as much metal and make half as many plates. I decided to co-sponsor the bill. It seemed simple enough. Not a big deal, right? Wrong. Very quickly, I became an unpopular person in Columbus. First, the folks from Ohio's School Bus Drivers Association showed up in my office. You can't support this bill, they said. Well, why not? Well, you know those flashing red lights that school buses switch on when they stop? When a car runs past one of our buses with its lights flashing, we have a better chance of getting their license plate number, and then we can notify the police. Well, I hadn't thought about that. Nobody wants to make it easier to put little kids in danger of getting off the bus. Then I heard from every law enforcement group in Ohio, the State Sheriff's Association, the Highway Patrol, and the state chapter of the Fraternal Order of Police. No, Boehner, they said. We gotta catch criminals. If you got 2 plates on a car, then we have twice as good a shot at catching them. You want to fight crime, right? Oh, yeah, I did. I hadn't thought about that either. Then the good folks from the 3M company showed up at my office. Turned out the 3M made the reflective material that goes on all the license plates. If this becomes law, they said, we're going to lose half our business in the state, which meant people would lose their jobs in Ohio, including people in my district. For good measure, they repeated all the things I'd already heard from the school bus drivers and the state police and sheriffs and all the rest of them. Meanwhile, I wasn't just hearing from groups, but individuals too. I got letters and phone calls into my office all day. God almighty, all I'd done was co-sponsor some simple bill. What was going on? I got one of those twitches again. Something just wasn't right. So I decided a little investigation was in order. As it turned out, the people behind this seemingly harmless piece of legislation were members of the Ohio Car Wash Associations. When Ohioans took their cars through an automatic car wash, the scrubbing mechanism would occasionally bend or beat up the front license plate. Customers would get pissed and yell at the owners. The owners preferred that didn't happen, of course. So instead of the expense of fixing their machines or paying for the damage to the cars, they decided to change the law and ruin my life.
I love this story because it reveals a few very important facts about politics. First off, something seemingly as simple as changing a law getting rid of license plates in the front of cars isn't simple at all. Why? Well, for starters, there really isn't a clear public interest when it comes to this issue, is there? Is this a good policy? Well, if you work at 3M producing reflective material, you probably have a different opinion on that than someone who owns a car wash. Rather than there being some clear answer to this, there are different competing interest groups who have different perspectives on the issue. Politicians have to navigate these competing interests on pretty much all issues. And while the general public usually isn't as invested in issues as granular as how many license plates a car should have, special interests are. They have way more stake in this than your average person. So if a politician is acting in their own best political interests, which again, I think most of them will reliably do, that usually means pleasing one of these interest groups or another. And that's another thing I love about Boehner's story. It shows what special interests really are. When you say special interests, a lot of people probably imagined high-powered corporate lobbyists. And that's certainly an aspect of them. But as we've seen, they can be a lot more humble and a lot more pervasive than that. And again, the thing about special interests, whether you're talking about K Street lobbyists or car wash owners in rural Ohio, they're much more likely to be invested in certain issues, and they're much more likely to take political action on those issues than your average voter is. For what it's worth, the only vehicles that require front license plates in Ohio now are tractors. It would appear as though the car wash owners got their way. Now, I imagine that if someone like Second Thought was in charge of the country, we would have a much different political system than we currently do. Presumably there would be no lobbying, no corporations, no campaign donations, let alone no debt ceiling. They would likely try and rid politics of all the various ways in which so-called special interests manifest and represent themselves. And I have no doubt that these reforms would have a significant impact on the system. The thing is, one aspect of politics that you'll never change is political actors doing what's in the best political interests. All you can change is who holds the keys to advancing those interests. As Alistair Smith and Bruce Bueno de Mesquita write in The Dictator's Handbook, Why Bad Behavior is Almost Always Good Politics.
Fundamentally, the nominal selectorate is the pool of potential support for a leader. The real selectorate includes those whose support is truly influential, and the winning coalition extends only to those essential supporters without whom the leader would be finished. A simple way to think of these groups is interchangeables, influentials, and essentials.
This dynamic exists in every different kind of government. It's just a matter of how large each respective group is.
Governments do not differ in kind. They differ along the dimensions of their selectorates and winning coalitions. These dimensions limit or liberate what leaders can and should do to keep their jobs. How limited or liberated a leader is depends on how selectorates and winning coalitions interact. No question it is tough to break the habit of talking about democracies and dictatorships as if either of these terms is sufficient to convey the differences across regimes, even though no two democracies are alike and neither are any two dictatorships. In fact, it is so hard to break that habit that we will continue to use these terms much of the time throughout this book. But it is important to emphasize that the term dictatorship really means a government based on a particularly small number of essentials, drawn from a very large group of interchangeables, and usually a relatively small batch of influentials. On the other hand, if we talk about democracy, we really mean a government founded on a very large number of essentials and a very large number of interchangeables, with the influential group being almost as big as the interchangeable group. When we mention monarchy or military junta, we have in mind that the number of interchangeables, influentials, and essentials is small.
So, if you put a politician in charge of the economy, even in a democratic fashion, the way people like Second Thought think we should, you're necessarily going to privilege some groups over others. People have different interests, and siding with one interest group over another is necessarily going to help elected officials and the bureaucrats those officials appoint with maintaining or gaining political power. While some institutional reforms may broaden the winning coalition, there's no possible way to bring the entire population into that group. Some groups will almost always be more invested in certain issues, and hence more willing to organize and take action over those issues. That is true of our mixed economy here in the United States, where the federal government subsidizes, taxes, regulates, etc., largely in alignment with political considerations, not economic ones. I have no doubt that this is exactly what would happen in a centrally planned economy. After all, what politicians are doing with, say, the ethanol program is economic planning. It's just not at the scale of, nor is it as heavy-handed as the economic planning of, say, the USSR. But that's another topic for another day. Take care for now, and have a wonderful Friday.